Hi, my name is Jocelyn Neal, and this workshop will review free response question 5 for the AP Music Theory exam. Welcome. I recommend you have some staff paper and a pencil with you so you can work the exercises along with me and take notes. Here is our agenda. We will start with an overview of the question. We will then review figured-based notation. We will talk about how to use a chord chart. We will discuss suspensions and 8/7 motion. We will do a brief review of cadential 6/4 chords and deceptive cadences, and then we will do a complete walkthrough of free response question 5 together. Now here are the basics. Free response question 5 is an exercise in realizing figured-based notation. You are given a baseline and figures, and your task is to realize that notation in 4 voices: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, using the basic part writing principles of common practice tonal voice leading of the 18th century Western classical tradition. The progression could be either in major or minor. Typically, it begins on tonic, is 7 chords long, and ends with a cadence. That cadence might be an authentic cadence, a deceptive cadence, or a half cadence. The chord progression is diatonic, and you are instructed not to add any embellishments or non-chord tones unless they are specified in the figures. You are expected to notate the progression on a grand staff with stems up for soprano and tenor and stems down for alto and bass. You must also provide a harmonic analysis for the progression, specifically by labeling it with Roman numerals. This question is scored out of a possible 25 points. After the weighting is applied to all of the questions, free response question 5 is worth 9% of your total AP Music Theory exam grade. The exam instructions suggest you spend about 15 minutes answering this question, but the amount of time you spend on it is up to you, as long as you are still within the total allotted time for Section 2, Part A of the exam. Now let's talk about figured-based notation. Figured-based notation tells you the intervals above the bass note. Figured-based notation uses a shorthand code for this information. One of the things you might have studied is the inversion hotline, which is just a really quick way to remember the figured-based notation for different chord inversions. And it goes like this: 6/6/4, 7/6/5, 4/3/4/2. 6/6/4, 7/6/5, 4/3/4/2. That is a way of remembering the figured-based notation that indicates the intervals above the bass for a root position triad, a first inversion triad, a second inversion triad, a root position 7th chord, a first inversion 7th chord, a second inversion 7th chord, or a third inversion 7th chord. Now, figured-based notation works in a shorthand system. So the numbers that you see, the 6/6/4, 7/6/5, 4/3/4/2, are representing the complete structure of the intervals above the bass, which are a 5/3 for a root position triad, 6/3 for a first inversion triad, 6/4 for a second inversion triad, 7/5/3 for a root position 7th chord, 6/5/3 for a first inversion 7th chord, 6/4/3 for a second inversion 7th chord, and 6/4/2 for a third inversion 7th chord. In each case, we want to make sure we know which chord tone is in the bass. So we would be able to talk about a root position chord as having the root of the chord in the bass. A first inversion chord has the third of the chord in the bass. A second inversion chord has the fifth of the chord in the bass. And if we're talking about 7th chords, a third inversion 7th chord has the chordal 7th in the bass. The most important thing to remember is in all cases, figured-based notation tells you the intervals above the bass. That's going to help you figure out more complicated chord progressions or situations where you have suspensions or 8/7 motion also in your figures. Now, the figures themselves tell you the interval size above the bass, and you are expected to apply the key signature to make sure that you have the correct interval quality. Here are some other tips on notation. If you see an accidental by itself under a bass note, that accidental is applied to the third above the bass. If you see an accidental, that could be a flat, a natural, or a sharp, that is next to an Arabic numeral, that is applied to the interval above the bass indicated by that number. A slash through the number means raise that pitch by a half step. And if there's a plus sign on the tail of a number 4, that also means raise that pitch by a half step. Let's look at a few examples of that. Here we are with a bass note in the key of E minor, and there's a sharp all by itself under that note. That means that that sharp is going to be applied to a third above the bass, and that means that somewhere in this chord, it could be in the tenor, it could be in the alto, or it could be in the soprano. Somewhere in this chord, we're going to have the note D sharp. The other notes in that chord are a fifth above the bass, and if we want an octave above the bass or a duplicate of any of those other notes we've already identified, that means that the total pitch content of this chord is going to have a B, which is already present in the bass, a D sharp. We know it's a D sharp because there is a sharp in that figure, and an F sharp, and we know that will be a sharp because the F sharp is in the key signature, and we would place those notes anywhere that makes sense for the voice leading. Let's look at our next example. Here we are in the key of G minor. We have the pitch G in the bass. There is a natural in the figured bass and a seventh in the figured bass. That means that that natural is going to be applied to a third above the bass. We also are going to have a pitch that is a seventh above the bass. And anytime we have a 7 in that figured bass, that tells me that the intervals above the bass are going to be 7, 5, and 3. That means that the pitches in this chord are going to include a G, which is already present in the bass, a B natural. We know that's a B natural because the natural in the figured bass indicates that, a D and an F. And that means that somewhere in this chord, in a voice that makes sense for the context of this chord, we're going to have the note B natural, we're going to have the note D, and we're going to have the note F. And let's look at the third example here. In this case, we are in the key of C major, and we have the pitch C in the bass, and there is a flat 7 written underneath it. Anytime we have a 7 in our figured bass, we know that is shorthand notation for 7, 5, 3. We're going to apply that flat to the note that is a 7th above the bass. That means the pitch content of this chord is going to have a C in it. We know that because that pitch is in the bass. We're going to have a third above the C, that's an E. We're going to have a fifth above the C, that's a G. And we're going to have a flat 7 above the C, that's going to be the note B flat. We know that's a B flat because of the flat showing up in the figure. And that means that somewhere in this chord, we're going to have the note G. Somewhere in this chord, we're going to have the note E. Somewhere in this chord, we will have the note B flat. Let's go over those other symbols that we might see. If you look at this first example, I have the note C in the bass. I have the figured bass notation of 4, 2. I know that is shorthand for 6, 4, 2. I see a slash through the 4, and a slash is the same thing as a sharp. That means I'm going to raise the note a fourth above the bass by a half step. The pitch content for this chord is going to involve a second above C, that's the note D, a fourth above C with a sharp on it, that's going to be an F sharp, and a sixth above the C, that's going to be an A, and then we've got the C already present in the bass. That means that this particular chord, somewhere in it is going to be the note D. Somewhere in it is going to be the note F sharp. Somewhere in it is going to be the note A. Look at my next example. In this case, I see that I have a 4 in my figured bass with a plus attached to the tail of the 4. That means the same thing as a slash. That means I'm going to raise the fourth above the bass by a half step. That means the pitch content of this chord is going to be D, F sharp, A, and C. That means somewhere in this chord, I'm going to have the pitch F sharp. Somewhere in this chord, I'm going to have the pitch D, and somewhere in this chord, I'm going to have the pitch A. And if we look at that last pitch that we have here, we have a bass note on the note A. We have figured bass of 6, 4, 3. The 6 has a slash through it. That means that we're going to put an accidental on the note a sixth above the bass to raise that note by a half step. So let's check the pitch content of that chord. I'm going to have an A in that chord. I am going to have a third above the bass, that's going to be the note C. I'm going to have a fourth above the bass, that's the note D. And I'm going to have a sixth above the bass that is raised with an accidental by a half step. That means my chord is going to have a D, F sharp, A, and C in it. The placement of those voices will be determined by the voice leading that has come before this chord and that will be used after this chord, but somewhere in this chord we're going to have the notes D and F sharp and C. Next, let's talk about chord charts. A chord chart is a quick reference tool to help you spell chords quickly and accurately in any key. You can also do this work in your head if you can do so both quickly and accurately. So here is how I would lay out a chord chart. I'm simply going to make a grid on my paper that has 7 vertical lines and 4 horizontal lines. And then I'm going to use this as a device to help me identify the chords in a key quickly and accurately. Let me demonstrate that. I'm going to start my chord chart by drawing 7 vertical lines on my paper. I'm then going to draw 4 horizontal lines. And whatever key I'm going to be working in, I'm going to list the Roman numerals across the bottom in that key. For now, let's build a chord chart in the key of A major. In A major, 1 is major, 2 is minor. I'm going to go ahead and use a 2-7 chord, which might show up. 3 is minor, 4 is major, 5 is major, and it's likely that I could encounter a 5-7 chord. 6 is minor, and 7 is a diminished triad, but I'm going to go ahead and list a half diminished 7th chord. Now I'm simply going to spell the scale for A major in my next row up. A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp. And then I'm going to spell each chord vertically. A, C sharp, E, B, D, F sharp, C sharp, E, G sharp, D, F sharp, A, E, G sharp, B, F sharp, A, C sharp, G sharp, B, D. And where I have 7th chords that might show up, I'm going to add the chordal 7th, starting with my 2-7 chord, B, D, F sharp, A, my 5-7 chord, E, G sharp, B, D, and my 7 half diminished 7th chord, G sharp, B, D, F sharp. What I can see on this chord chart is the root of each chord, the 3rd of each chord, the 5th of each chord, and the 7th of each chord where I am likely to encounter 7th chords. I also can quickly see where my chordal 7ths are, which will require resolution, and I can quickly see where my leading tones are, which may also require resolution. Now let's do this exercise again for a minor key. I will begin with 7 vertical lines and 4 horizontal lines. I'll choose the key that I'm working in. In this case, let's do a chord chart for the key of G minor. I'm going to have a minor 1. 2 will be a half diminished 7th chord. 3 is major. 4 is minor. 5 is major. 6 is major. And 7 in this case will be a fully diminished 7th chord. I'm going to spell my scale in G minor. G, A, B flat, C, D, E flat, and I'm going to use harmonic minor here because I know that when I'm spelling chords, I'm likely to encounter that raised scale degree 7. I'm now going to stack my chords vertically. G, B flat, D, A, C, E flat, G. That's my half diminished chord built on scale degree 2. B flat, D, F, C, E flat, G, D, F sharp, A, C, raising my leading tone in that dominant function chord, E flat, G, B flat, F sharp, A, C, E flat. And I notice where my chordal 7ths are, and I notice where my leading tones are. Off this chart, I can easily see what the root of each chord is, what the 3rd of each chord is, what the 5th of each chord is, and what the 7th of each chord is. In each of these cases, if I'm looking at a chord that I know is going to be in a particular inversion, this chart can quickly and easily help me identify the pitch content of the chord and its Roman numeral. Let's talk about suspensions and voice leading. Figured bass notation may include a suspension, or it may also show 8/7 motion. When you see a dash in figured bass notation, it indicates that that motion from one interval above the bass to the next interval above the bass must occur in one voice. On the AP Music Theory exam, 4/3 must be treated like a suspension, and the 4th above the bass must be prepared by common tone. You cannot treat that 4/3 as an appoggiatura and its resolution. You must treat it as a suspension. Now let's talk about the rhythm of a suspension. If the duration of the chord can be divided into 2, then the suspended tone gets half the duration of that chord, and the resolution of that suspension gets half the duration. In other words, if we're talking about a 4-3 suspension, the fourth above the bass is going to last for half the value of that chord, and the third above the bass will get the other half of that value. If the duration of the chord can be divided into 3, then the suspended tone gets 2/3 of the duration, and the resolution of the suspension gets 1/3 of the duration. Let's say you have a dotted half note, and there's a 4-3 suspension on that dotted half note. The fourth above the bass will have a half note value, and its resolution to a third above the bass will have the quarter note value. If you see an indication for 8/7 motion, that means that you're going to have a pitch an octave above the bass, and you will move that pitch down to a seventh above the bass, thereby introducing a chordal seventh into the chord. Let's look at some examples of these. Here is an example in D minor. The first pitch I have is a G in the bass, and the figures under it indicate 6/5. That is shorthand for 6/5-3, and that indicates a seventh chord in first inversion. The pitch content of that chord will be E, G, B flat, and D. I'm going to choose to place those pitches in voices that make sense from whatever would have come before. I'm going to put the D in the soprano. I'm going to put the E in the alto, and I will put the B flat in the tenor voice. Moving into the next chord, I had a chordal seventh. That chordal seventh is the pitch D, and I need to keep track of that because chordal sevenths must resolve down by step. My next chord has figured bass of a 4-sharp under the pitch A. That's indicating a 4-3 suspension. That sharp by itself is going to be applied to the third above the bass. Once that suspension resolves, I'm looking at a root position triad. So the pitch content of this chord will be A, C sharp, and E. The suspended voice must be prepared by common tone, and therefore I look at the previous chord, I find the note D, which will become a fourth above the bass. I'm going to keep that D for half the value of this chord, and then I'm going to resolve it down in quarter note rhythms to the C sharp, which is a third above the bass. Remember that you cannot double a suspension, and you cannot have the note of resolution, which is a C sharp in this case, present in any other voice. Therefore, my alto and my tenor voices must be on the notes A or E. I'm going to keep my common tone E in the alto and move my tenor down to A. When this chord resolves into the final triad, my C sharp in the soprano is a leading tone. It's going to go up. I'm going to lift my alto to the note F and keep my tenor on an A. And I have now accurately written a 4-3 suspension. Let's look at the next example. In the next example, I have the pitch A in the bass, and the figures under it are 8-7 and a sharp by itself. The sharp by itself applies to a third above the bass. And so the pitch content when this chord begins will have the notes A, C sharp, E, and then I'm going to have somewhere above the bass a note an octave above the bass, which is another A, and that A is going to move down to a G to match the indication of 8-7. Let's go ahead and voice this chord. I've got an A in the bass. I'm going to put another A in the tenor. I've got to have an E in the alto, and I'm choosing to put my C sharp in the soprano. The 8-7 motion means that in the span of this chord, I will find whatever pitch is an octave above the bass, and I will move it down to a seventh above the bass, splitting the time of that chord in half. And if I want to resolve this chord, which is now a dominant seventh chord, the chordal seventh moves down, the leading tone in an outer voice moves up, and in this case, I'm going to bring my alto down so that I will end up with a tripled root and a single third in my chord. That's 8-7 motion. Here are some additional notes on suspensions. 4-3 suspensions can occur in the final chord of a half cadence, or in other words, the 5 chord. Here are some additional notes on suspensions. A 4-3 suspension can occur in the final chord of a half cadence, or in other words, that would be on the 5 chord. A 4-3 suspension can occur in the final chord of an authentic cadence. That would be the tonic chord if it's coming from a dominant seventh chord. 4-3 suspensions can occur in the penultimate chord of an authentic cadence or a deceptive cadence. That would be the 5 or the 5-7 chord that occurs before the final chord. And there are other locations where you might find them, but those are going to be the most common ones that you will see on the AP Music Theory exam. Let's talk briefly about cadential 6/4 chords. You might see a cadential 6/4 chord in the figured bass notation, and please remember that the voice leading for a cadential 6/4 chord must be handled properly. Always double the bass in a cadential 6/4 chord. Approach the fourth above the bass by common tone, that's your most preferred option, or by step, that's totally fine, or by an ascending leap if there's no other option. And then as a last resort, in a few situations where you cannot approach the fourth above the bass by common tone or step or an ascending leap, it's okay to approach by a descending third. In a cadential 6/4 chord, the motion within the voices is indicated specifically by the figured bass notation itself. Move the sixth above the bass down to a fifth above the bass. Move the fourth above the bass down to a third above the bass. And if there is an 8/7 in your figure, move the octave above the bass down to a seventh above the bass. Some styles of notation omit the dashes, but you would still treat the voice leading the same whether there's a dash there or not. So be prepared for your figured bass to look like any of these 7 examples. Let's work through the first 3 examples together. We'll begin in G minor. I find the pitch C in the bass with a figured bass notation of 6 under it. That's short for 6/3. The pitch content of that chord will be A, C, E flat. I'm going to voice that chord such that I have an A in the soprano. I'm going to have an E flat in the alto, and I'm going to have an additional C in the tenor. Moving into my next chord, I have the indication of figured bass 8/6/4. This is a cadential 6/4 chord. It occurs on a metrically strong beat. The pitch content of that chord is going to have a D in the bass. That D is going to be doubled. There's also going to be a fourth above the D, which is the pitch G, and a sixth above the D, which is the pitch B flat. I'm going to bring my alto from the E flat down to the D to double the bass. I'm going to bring my soprano down to the G, which is a fourth above the bass, and I'm going to bring my tenor down to a B flat. I'm going to follow the indications of the figures, which tell me that the octave above the bass moves down to a seventh above the bass. That will occur in my alto voice. The soprano is currently on the pitch G. That is a fourth above the bass. It is going to move down to a raised third above the bass. That sharp in the figure indicates a raised third above the bass. And my tenor is on the note B flat. That's a sixth above the bass. It's going to move down to a fifth above the bass. The pitch content of that chord is D, F sharp, A, and C. C is a chordal seventh, F sharp is a leading tone. When I resolve those pitches into the next chord, which will be a root position tonic triad, my soprano F sharp is going to go up to G. My chordal seventh C is going to go down to B flat, and I'm going to bring my tenor down to a G, resulting in a chord that is voiced with a tripled root and a single third. The Roman numeral analysis of this progression in the key of G minor begins with a 2 chord, which is a diminished triad in first inversion. It then moves into a dominant function chord, which is a cadential 6/4 chord. That resolves into a dominant 7th chord, and that resolves finally into a root position tonic triad. There are 2 common ways to analyze this chord progression. The first of these represents the pitch content, which shows you the pitch content of a tonic chord in second inversion, moving into a dominant 7th chord. It is also correct to use notation that indicates function. It is equally correct, therefore, to label this as a 2 diminished 6 chord, moving into a dominant function chord, which has notes an octave, 6th, and 4th above the bass, moving into a 7th, 5th, and 3rd above the bass, resolving into tonic. Either of those notation systems is accepted on the AP Music Theory exam. Let's look at the next example. Here we are in the key of E flat major. We're beginning with the note A flat in the bass, and the figured bass under it indicates a 6. That's shorthand for 6/3. That tells me the pitch content of that chord is F, A flat, and C. The next pitch I have in the bass is a B flat, and the figured bass under it indicates a 6th and a 4th above the bass. That's going to mean that I have a B flat in the bass. Double that note because you always double the bass in a cadential 6/4 chord. A 4th above that bass will be an E flat, and a 6th above that bass will be a G. The next note in the bass is a B flat, and all that is listed under it is a 7, which I know is shorthand for 753. The pitch content of that chord will be a B flat, a D, an F, and an A flat, and then that resolves into a chord that is built on E flat. The figured bass is blank, which means root position triad. Pitch content of that chord will be E flat, G, B flat. Let's go ahead and part write this chord. I'm going to begin here with an A flat in the soprano. I'll place an F in the alto and a C in my tenor. Moving into the next chord, I have a B flat in the bass. I must double the bass. I'll put that B flat in the tenor. I also need to have one E flat and one G present. I'll place those in the alto and soprano respectively. The octave above the bass is going to move into the chordal seventh. That means my tenor is going to move from the pitch B flat down to A flat. My fourth above the bass is going to move down to a third above the bass. That means my E flat goes down to the leading tone D. And my sixth above the bass G is going to step down to the pitch F. When I resolve this chord, I keep in mind that I have a chordal seventh and a leading tone in it. The chordal seventh, A flat, is in the tenor. It needs to move down to the pitch G. The leading tone is in the alto. That gives me some options. That leading tone in an inner voice is allowed to skip down to the chordal fifth, and I will bring my soprano down to tonic, resulting in a complete root position tonic triad. And let's do our third example. Here we are in the key of F minor. My first pitch is a D flat. It has a figured bass indication of 6 under it. That's short for 6-3. That means the pitch content of that chord is going to be a B flat, a D flat, and an F. It's moving into a cadential 6-4 chord, which has the bass note C. In a cadential 6-4 chord, I always double the bass. It also has a fourth above the bass. That will be the note F, and a sixth above the bass. That will be the note A flat. The figured bass indicates that that fourth is going to move to a third above the bass with a natural applied to it. That means my F is going to go to E natural. My bass note remains on C. The sixth above the bass is going to move down to a fifth above the bass, and the octave above the bass C will move down to a B flat. That's going to resolve into a root position triad built on F. The pitch content of that chord will be F, A flat, and C. Let's part write that chord. We're going to start with our first chord with a D flat in the bass, and I'm going to place a B flat somewhere above that, the note F, and in this case, I'm going to choose to double the note F. Moving into my next chord, I have a C in the bass. I have to have another voice on C as well. I will choose to place my soprano on that C. I have to have an A flat and an F. I'm going to keep my F in the alto and place my A flat in the tenor. Moving into the next chord, the fourth above the bass is the note F. It must move down to a raised third above the bass. That raised third is an E natural because of the figured bass. My tenor is going to step down to the note G. My soprano is going to move down to the chordal seventh, which is a B flat. And I notice that I have a perfect fifth condensing into a diminished fifth. That is absolutely okay. I can move from a perfect fifth into a diminished fifth. That is acceptable voice leading. And now to resolve that chord, my chordal seventh is going to come down to the note A flat. My leading tone in this case is going to jump down to the chordal fifth, and I will allow my tenor to step down to double the bass. Let's do a quick Roman numeral analysis here. My first chord was a 4 chord in first inversion. That moved into a cadential 6-4 chord, which resolved into a dominant 7th chord, which finally resolved into a tonic root position triad. It is equally correct to show the Roman numerals that indicate chord function. We'll begin with a 4 chord in first inversion. We will move to a dominant function chord, which is a cadential 6-4 chord. That cadential 6-4 chord then moves into a dominant 7th chord. And finally, that dominant 7th chord resolves to tonic. Now let's talk about deceptive cadences. A deceptive cadence resolves a dominant chord into a tonic substitute. That's going to be when your 5 chord goes to 6 or when your 5-7 chord goes to 6. This can happen in a major key, which brings you to a minor chord built on scale degree 6. Or it can happen in a minor key, which brings you to a major chord built on lowered scale degree 6. Only the bass moves to scale degree 6 in a deceptive cadence. The soprano, alto, and tenor voices should all resolve as if they were headed towards a regular tonic chord. In other words, your soprano, alto, and tenor voices are all going to head to scale degrees 1 or 3. The result in almost every instance will be a doubled third, which is tonic or scale degree 1, and that's the third of the chord. If the penultimate chord is an incomplete 5/7 chord, then the final chord may have a doubled fifth, which is scale degree 3. But note, this is pretty rare. Here is what a deceptive cadence will look like in your figured bass exercises. And let's work some of these together. Here we are in the key of E flat. Our figured bass begins with the pitch B flat, and this is our cadential 6/4 chord. So in this chord, we're going to have doubled the bass. That's going to be another B flat. We'll have somebody on E flat. We'll have somebody on G. We're going to move down all of those pitches into a dominant 7th chord. The 4th above the bass is E flat. It's going to come down to a D. The 6th above the bass is a G. It's going to come down to an F. And the B flat, which is an octave above the bass, will move down into the chordal 7th. It's time to resolve this chord in a deceptive cadence. A chordal 7th, which is the pitch A flat, must go down. So that's going to come down to the note G. The leading tone, which is the pitch D, is going to go up to an E flat. And the soprano is on F, which is scale degree 2, and that is also going to come down to the E flat. That is the correct resolution of my dominant 7th chord into a minor triad in root position built on scale degree 6. Let's do one more example. Here we are in the key of B minor. My first pitch in the bass is an F sharp, and it has the intervals of a 4th, a 6th, and an octave above it. That means I'm going to have the notes B, D, and F sharp. I'm going to resolve my cadential 6/4 chord into a dominant 7th chord by bringing the 4th above the bass down to a raised 3rd above the bass. That's going to be a B moving down to an A sharp. The 6th above the bass is going to come down to a 5th above the bass. That means my alto D is going to move down to the note C sharp. And my soprano, which is currently on F sharp, is going to step down to create the chordal 7th on the note E. It's time to resolve this dominant 7th chord into the deceptive cadence. I'm going to begin by locating the chordal 7th. That's the note E. Chordal 7ths resolve down, so my soprano is going to move down to the pitch D, which is scale degree 3, and which is, in this particular case, the chordal 5th. My leading tone, A sharp, is in the tenor. That leading tone wants to go up, and so I'm going to take that up to the pitch B, which is scale degree 1, which is the chordal 3rd. And I'm going to have my alto move down to B as well, doubling the chordal 3rd, which is the correct resolution of this deceptive cadence. Let me briefly show you the most common errors that students make. Students may be tempted to have the C sharp go up to D. If you do that, you have written parallel fifths with the bass. Students may also be tempted to try to double the pitch G because it's the root of the chord, and they might choose to take the tenor voice down to G, in which case they have written an interval of an augmented second, which is an error. Finally, students might try to move the soprano up to the root of the chord, which is a G. If you do that, you have written direct octaves with the bass and failed to resolve the chordal 7th, and that is also an error. So to review our correct voice leading, the chordal 7th comes down, the leading tone goes up, and I'm going to take the alto down to scale degree 1, which is the chordal 3rd, and double that in my final chord. Now let's talk through how to work an FR5 question. Step 1, identify the key, circle it. Step 2, write the figured bass inversions, such as the inversion hotline, on your paper as a reference. Step 3, write out a quick chord chart for the key of this exercise. Step 4, as you work through the exercise, spell the chords above the staff and circle any tendency tones. That would be your chordal 7ths or your leading tones. Next, write in the Roman numerals. And then finally, as you begin to part write, work on 2 or 3 chords at a time, writing the soprano line for that short segment, then filling in the alto and the tenor. Now, as you write a note on the staff, go ahead and check off the letter name of that pitch above the staff so that you make sure you are spelling your chords accurately and completely. Once you finish this, go back and check for any part writing errors in case you need to make any adjustments. Now, the reason that I emphasize such meticulous spelling of your chords in this question is that in this question, you get 1 point for each chord that is spelled correctly, and you get 2 points for the voice leading into that chord and 2 points for the voice leading out of that chord. However, if you make a mistake in the spelling of the chord, you don't get any points for the voice leading into it or any points for the voice leading out of it. So it's a very expensive mistake to make a chord spelling error. For that reason, we want to have a working method that helps us to check very carefully our chord spelling. Now let's work through some FR5s together. Here is an FR5. I'm going to begin by noticing I'm in the key of B minor, and I'm going to write out my inversion hotline 664, 765, 43, 42. I'm also going to make myself a chord chart in the key of B minor. I'll begin with 7 vertical lines and 4 horizontal lines. I'm in a minor key, so 1 is minor, 2 is going to be a half diminished 7th chord, 3 is major, 4 is minor, 5 is major, 6 is major, and 7, I'm going to use the fully diminished 7th chord there. My pitch content in B minor is B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G, and A sharp, using that raised leading tone there. I'll spell each chord, B, D, F sharp, C sharp, E, G, D, F sharp, A, E, G, B, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, G, B, D, A sharp, C sharp, E. I'm going to put my chordal sevenths on there. My 2 half diminished 7th chord is C sharp, E, G, B. And my 5/7 chord is F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, E. And my 7 fully diminished 7th chord is A sharp, C sharp, E, and G. Now let's study our figures. I have a root position triad where I see just a 6. That means first inversion triad, and the intervals above the bass will be 6/3. Where I see 6/5, that's going to be a first inversion 7th chord, and the intervals above the bass will be 6/5/3. Where I see 8 over a sharp, that sharp applies to the 3rd above the bass, and that's going to be moving into a dominant 7th chord, and that will be ending on a root position triad. With that much information, I can write in my Roman numerals. I have a 1 chord in root position. I have a passing 6/4 chord. The Roman numeral for that is going to be a 5 chord. That's moving to a 1 chord in first inversion. That's moving to a 4 chord in first inversion. I then have a 2 half diminished 6/5 chord, moving into a dominant triad with 8/7 motion, bringing in the chordal 7th, resolving deceptively to a major chord built on scale degree 6. Next, I'm going to write in the pitch content above each chord. The first chord is given to me. It's a B minor triad in root position, B, D, F sharp, doubling the B. The next chord has in it an F sharp, A sharp, C sharp. The next chord is a B triad in first inversion, B, D, F sharp. The next chord is an E minor triad in first inversion. Pitch content is E, G, B. The next chord is a 2 half diminished 6/5. That's going to be a 2 half diminished 7th chord in first inversion. Pitch content there is C sharp, E, G, and B. The next chord is an F sharp major triad, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, with 8/7 motion, bringing an F sharp down to the note E, which becomes the chordal 7th, resolving deceptively into a G major triad, G, B, D. I'm now ready to begin part writing. I'm going to start by treating the first 3 chords as a 3-chord unit. I'm going to take the B in the soprano and bring that down to my leading tone A sharp. I'm going to resolve that back up to B. This is a standard tonic expansion. I'm going to keep a common tone F sharp all the way across that chord, and my tenor is going to engage in a voice exchange with the bass D, C sharp, B. I'm going to take the time to check off each chord and the pitches that I have written. I have an A sharp, I have an F sharp, I have a C sharp, and the doubled note is going to be a C sharp. That is the correct doubling for a passing 6/4 chord. In chord number 3, I have a D present in the bass, I have a B in the tenor, I have an F sharp in the alto, and I have another B in the soprano. My next chord is a 4 chord in first inversion. I'm going to keep my common tone B in the soprano. I'm going to keep the common tone B in the bass, and I'm going to bring my alto down to the note E. That gives me one G in the bass, a B in the tenor, an E in the alto, and a second B in the soprano. My next chord is a seventh chord. It has a chordal seventh in it. I'm going to pay attention to all of my chordal sevenths because they have to be resolved correctly. To voice this chord, I'm going to keep the common tone B in the soprano. That's going to be my chordal seventh. Chordal sevenths must resolve down, so I can go ahead and take that B down to an A sharp in the next chord. Now let's finish our two half diminished 6/5 chord. I have an E in the bass. I have a B in the soprano. I need a G and a C sharp. I'm going to put the G in the alto, and I'm going to step up to the C sharp in the tenor. Moving into my dominant triad, I'm going to have an F sharp in the alto. I'm going to keep my common tone C sharp in the tenor. And then I see the 8/7 motion in my figure, which means that I'm going to take half the duration of this chord and keep it on the octave above the bass, and half the duration of this chord and move it down to the pitch E. That E is a chordal seventh. Chordal sevenths must resolve properly. So I'm going to take that chordal seventh down to the note D in my alto. The leading tone in the soprano, it needs to go up to tonic. Leading tones in outer voices must resolve up. And I'm going to bring my tenor voice C sharp down to a B. This results in scale degree 1 being doubled in that final chord. Let's check our pitch content. We have a G, we have a B in the tenor, we have a D in the alto, and we have another B in the soprano. That is the correct doubling. Let's back up and check our chord spelling on our dominant seventh chord. We have an F sharp in the bass, we have an A sharp in the soprano, we have a C sharp in the tenor, and we have an F sharp moving into an E in the alto voice. Finally, let's take a moment to identify our leading tones. In this particular progression, we have a leading tone in chord number 2, and we have a leading tone in the penultimate chord in that dominant seventh chord. In each case, the leading tone happens to be in the soprano. Leading tones in a soprano voice must resolve up, so I can check my voice leading on that. And that is a complete answer for this free response question 5. Here's B minor. Here's the first chord. Here's the progression. Here is a free response question number 5, and we'll begin by checking the key. We are in A major. We will write out our inversion hotline to keep track of our figures for figured bass: 6, 6, 4, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 4, 2. Those are indicating my triads in root position, first inversion, second inversion, and my seventh chords in root position, first inversion, second inversion, and third inversion. I'm then going to draw out a quick chord chart in the key of A major. I'll begin with 7 vertical lines and 4 horizontal lines. I'm in the key of A major. In the key of A major, 1 is major, 2 is minor, 3 is minor, 4 is major, 5 is major, 6 is minor, and 7 is diminished. I'm going to include a 7th on my 2 chord. I'm going to include a 7th on my 5 chord, and I'm going to make the quality of that 7 chord a 7 half diminished 7th chord. I'm going to spell my A major scale: A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, and G sharp. And I will spell each of my chords: A, C sharp, E, B, D, F sharp. I'll put the chordal 7th on there as an A, C sharp, E, G sharp, D, F sharp, A, E, G sharp, B. I'll put the chordal 7th on there as a D, F sharp, A, C sharp, and finally G sharp, B, D, and F sharp. Now I'm ready to take a look at my figures. I have a root position triad, a root position triad, a first inversion triad, a first inversion triad, a cadential 6/4 chord moving into a dominant 7th chord, resolving deceptively into a root position triad. I can put my Roman numerals in at this point. I have a root position tonic chord. I have a minor chord built on scale degree 6. I have a tonic chord in first inversion. That's a standard arpeggiation and tonic expansion there. I then move into a 2 chord in first inversion. I now have a cadential 6/4 chord, and there are 2 different ways to analyze that. The first way I will show you is using the pitch content to identify this as a 1 chord in second inversion. I know it carries dominant function. It's moving directly into a dominant seventh chord, resolving deceptively into a minor sixth chord. Or for those of you who use function notation, I can also identify this cadential 6/4 chord as one that is carrying dominant function, and I'll show the indications of 864-753 resolving deceptively into a sixth chord. Either is correct. Now I will write the pitch content of each chord above the staff. I'm going to start with my A chord in root position, A, C sharp, E. I next have an F sharp minor chord in root position, F sharp, A, C sharp. I now have an A chord in first inversion. The pitch content is A, C sharp, E. I now have a B minor chord in first inversion, B, D, F sharp. That moves into my cadential 6/4 chord, which has the note E in the bass. It has a fourth above the E, which is the note A. It has a sixth above the E, which is the note C sharp, and I always double the bass. The bass remains the same in my next chord. The fourth above the bass comes down to a G sharp. The sixth above the bass comes down to a B, and the octave above the bass moves down to the note D, resolving deceptively into an F sharp minor chord, F sharp, A, C sharp. I'm going to take a moment to identify my leading tones and my chordal sevenths. In this particular progression, I have a chordal seventh and a leading tone in my 5/7 chord. The G sharp is the leading tone, the D is the chordal seventh. That chordal seventh is going to need to come down, and that G sharp wants to go up, depending on which voice it ends up in. On the AP exam, the first chord will be voiced for you, but I'll go ahead and voice this one right here. I'm going to put a C sharp in my soprano. I'm going to have an A in my alto, and I'm going to space my tenor on the pitch E. All of those pitches spell my chord with an A C sharp, and E, and in this case, I have a doubled A. As my basses are arpeggiating down, I'm going to keep my soprano on a common tone C sharp, and then I'm going to lift it up to the pitch E, spreading out the chord voicing by that third chord. For my second chord, I will keep my alto on a common tone A, and I will move my tenor up to an F sharp. As I move into my third chord, I will continue to keep the alto on the common tone A, and I will bring my tenor back down to an E. Let's check our pitch content. In our second chord, we had an F sharp in the bass. We doubled that F sharp with the tenor. We had an A and a C sharp. In my third chord, I had a C sharp in the bass. I had an E in the tenor. I had an A in the alto, and I doubled that E with the soprano. Moving into my next chord, I need the pitch content of B, D, and F sharp. I'm going to bring my soprano down to a D. I have a D in the bass. I have a D in the soprano. That means I need an F sharp and a B. I'm going to lift my tenor up to F sharp. That is still within an acceptable range for the tenor voice. I'm going to place my B in the alto voice. I now have both the B and the F sharp covered in my chord spelling. Moving into my cadential 6/4 chord, a cadential 6/4 chord must double the bass. I have one E present already in the bass voice. I'm going to double that with the tenor. I also need an A, which can come in the alto, and a C sharp, which can come in the soprano. The voice leading of my cadential 6/4 chord is dictated by the figures. The octave above the bass, which is the note E in the tenor, is going to step down to the pitch D. That will be the chordal seventh. The fourth above the bass, which is the note A, is going to come down to a G sharp. And the soprano is on the pitch that is a sixth above the bass. That's going to come down to a fifth above the bass. I now have present the E in the bass, the G sharp in the alto, the B in the soprano, and the D in the tenor. Chordal sevenths must resolve down, so in the tenor voice, I will bring that D down to a C sharp. My leading tone in a deceptive cadence needs to resolve up to tonic, so I'm going to take my alto up to the pitch A, and I'm going to bring my soprano down to the double that pitch A. I have one F sharp present in the bass, I have one C sharp present in the alto, and I have two A's. That is the correct doubling in a deceptive cadence. And that is a complete free response question 5. Here's A major. Here's the first chord. Here's the progression. Here is a free response question 5 in the key of G minor. I'm going to write out my inversion hotline. it starts with nothing, and then I have 6, 6, 4. Those are my triad inversions. And then I have 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 4, 2. That's a reference chart for figured bass that indicates different inversions of triads and seventh chords. I will now write out 7 vertical lines so that I can draw a chord chart and 4 horizontal lines. This chart will be in the key of G minor. I have a minor 1 chord. My 2 chord is going to be listed as a half diminished 7th chord. My 3 chord will be major. 4 is minor. 5 is major, and I will write out the pitch content of a dominant 7th chord. 6 is major, and 7 will be a fully diminished 7th chord. Let's spell our G minor scale. G, A, B flat, C, D, E flat. We will use harmonic minor here and indicate F sharp. And now I will spell my chords vertically. G, B flat, D, A, C, E flat, G, B flat, D, F, C, E flat, G, D, F sharp, A, C, E flat, G, B flat, F sharp, A, C, E flat. This gives me a reference chart that tells me the root of each chord, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. On the AP exam, the voicing of that first chord will be given to you. So I'll go ahead and write in a voicing here. I'm going to use a B flat in my tenor, a D in the alto, and a G in the soprano. Now let's take a look at our figures. We start with a root position triad built on G, a root position triad built on E flat. We then have a first inversion 7th chord whose root will be A, whose bass note is C. We then have a third inversion 7th chord. The figures above the bass are going to be 6, 4, 2, and I know that I'm going to need an accidental on the 4th above the bass. I then have a first inversion triad whose bass note is B flat, whose root is going to be G. I then have a root position triad built on the note C, and then I have a 4-3 suspension, and when I get done with that, the sharp is going to apply to a third above the bass, and I will be on a root position triad. With that much information, I can write my Roman numerals in. I have a root position tonic triad, moving to a root position triad built on scale degree 6. I then have a 2 half diminished 6-5, followed by a 5-4-2. That moves to a 1 chord in first inversion. That is followed by a 4 chord in root position. And then I have a 5 chord, which contains a 4-3 suspension. I'm going to write the pitch content of each chord above the staff. I'll begin with my tonic triad, G, B flat, D. The next chord has the pitch content of E flat, G, B flat. The next chord has the pitch content of A, C, E flat, and G. The next chord has the pitch content of D, F sharp, A, and C. Notice that the slash through the number 4 means raise the 4th above the bass. That's where my F sharp comes from. The next chord is a tonic triad, G, B flat, and D. The next chord is a 4 chord in root position. That's C, E flat, G. And my final chord is a dominant triad, D, F sharp, A. And that F sharp is approached by a 4-3 suspension. That's a 4th above the bass, which is the note G, moving into the 3rd above the bass, which is the note F sharp. Let's mark all of my tendency tones. I have a chordal 7th in my 3rd chord. I have a leading tone and a chordal 7th in my 4th chord. And I have a suspension in my last chord. The suspension must be approached by common tone, which means that the G in the previous chord must be carried over to create that suspended tone. Let's begin part writing. My soprano voice begins on a G. That G is a common tone into the next chord, so I will keep it. And then I'm going to continue that G into the next chord. That G in my 3rd chord is a chordal 7th. Chordal 7ths must resolve down, so I'm going to move that soprano pitch down into an F sharp. Moving back to chord number 2, I have present an E flat in the bass. I have present a G in the soprano. I need a B flat. I'm going to keep my common tone in the tenor, and I will move my alto up to E flat, which doubles the root of that chord. My next chord has already a C in the bass, a G in the soprano. I need an E flat and an A. I'm going to keep my E flat common tone in the alto, move my tenor down to an A. The G has already resolved down into the F sharp as a chordal 7th should. The C is present in the bass. I need a D and an A. I'll keep my common tone A in the tenor and place the D in the alto. Moving into my next chord. The F sharp in the soprano is a leading tone. Leading tones must move up in the soprano, so that's going to bring my soprano up to the note G. I already have a B flat present in the bass, so I need a D. I'm going to keep the common tone D in the alto. And in this particular case, I'm going to choose to move my tenor down to the note G. My next chord is a C minor triad. I'm going to keep my G common tone in the soprano. I already have present the C in the bass. I need an E flat. I'm going to bring that E flat in through the alto. And I'm going to move my tenor up to the pitch C to double the bass. Moving into my final chord, I have an interval of a fourth above the bass that is indicated in my figures. That is going to be a suspension. Suspensions must be prepared by common tone, and therefore that suspension is going to occur in the soprano. I will take half the value of that chord for the G and the other half of the value of that chord for its resolution into an F sharp. The sharp in my figured bass indicates raise the third above the bass. That will be the note F sharp. I'm going to choose to bring my tenor down to the pitch A. And I'm going to take my alto down to D, which doubles the bass, allowing only one voice to carry the suspended tone and its resolution. As we look at this progression, we notice that we have a half cadence at the end, which has a 4/3 suspension on it. We also find that 5/4/2 chord, which is chord number 4 in this progression, as a dominant 7th chord in third inversion, and we check and notice that indeed, as all dominant 7th chords in third inversion have to do, it resolves into a tonic chord in first inversion. Let's take a listen to this progression. Here's G minor. Here's the first chord. Here's the progression. Let's summarize our 6 top tips. Remember, figured bass tells you the intervals above the bass. Use a chord chart. Write the pitch content of each chord above the staff. Chord spelling matters. Resolve tendency tones. Those are your leading tones and chordal sevenths. Look for 2 and 3 chord patterns that you have studied, especially tonic expansions and cadential patterns. I want to emphasize this last tip. You're always looking for patterns of chord progressions that you've studied in other contexts that you can then apply as you're working on your figured bass questions. Thanks for watching.